You hear nothing at first, just the wind. Then footsteps, yours, shuffling through dust that was once a marketplace. The city gate behind you hangs open, but you know it doesn't matter. There's nowhere to go. The walls that once protected you now trap you inside with thousands of others who grow thinner by the day. You haven't seen bread in 3 weeks. Yesterday, your neighbor's dog disappeared. This morning, you understood why. This is what it felt like to face Genghis Khan's patience. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It's absolutely incredible that a story this dark, from 8 centuries ago, can reach people on every continent today. The year is 1220. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in Central Asia, has made a fatal miscalculation. They executed Mongol trade envoys, an insult Genghis Khan would never forgive. His response wasn't just military, it was methodical, calculated, and designed to break the human spirit before breaking the body. The Mongols didn't just conquer cities. They transformed warfare itself into an instrument of psychological devastation so complete that even today, historians struggle to comprehend the scale of what unfolded across Persia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. What makes Genghis Khan's methods so chilling isn't their brutality alone. It's their precision. Every tactic served a purpose. Every horror had a function. This wasn't rage, it was engineering. And the archive records left behind by Persian chroniclers, Russian monks, and Chinese officials paint a picture of conquest that transcended mere violence and became something else entirely. A systematic dismantling of civilizations through tactics so extreme they seem almost impossible to believe. Yet they happened, and they worked. The siege of Nishapur began not with fire or assault, but with silence. The Mongol army surrounded the city completely, establishing a perimeter so tight that not even a message could escape. Genghis Khan's engineers, yes, engineers, conducted calculations. They estimated the city's grain reserves, counted its population, measured the capacity of its wells. They weren't guessing how long the siege would take. They were scheduling it. Inside, the inhabitants believed their walls would save them. Nishapur's fortifications were formidable, its garrison experienced. But the Mongols didn't attack the walls. They attacked time itself. Week by week, the food supplies dwindled. First, the livestock was slaughtered, then the grain stores emptied. Then came the leather, boiled and chewed for whatever nutrition it might offer. Then the rats disappeared, hunted to extinction by desperate families. Atta Malik Juvaini, the Persian chronicler who documented the Mongol campaigns with horrifying detail, wrote something that still echoes across centuries. None remained to bury the corpses, and the dogs feasted on the flesh of the faithful. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing what he witnessed in city after city. The Mongols had turned starvation from a consequence of siege into a weapon as deliberate as any arrow. But here's what makes this tactic genuinely terrifying. It wasn't about killing people quickly. It was about transformation. The Mongols understood that a starving city doesn't just weaken militarily. It collapses morally. Neighbors turn on neighbors. Families make unspeakable choices. The social fabric that holds a community together simply disintegrates. And when the gates finally opened, whether through surrender or breach, the Mongols didn't find warriors. They found ghosts. The survivors of these sieges, skeletal and hollow-eyed, were often massacred anyway. But some were spared, deliberately, and sent to neighboring cities with one message. Resistance leads here, to this, to a fate worse than battle. The psychological impact rippled outward. Cities that might have resisted for months surrendered after days, terrified not of dying in combat but of dying like that. Slowly, helplessly, watching their humanity erode with their bodies. Yet starvation was only one layer of the Mongol approach to conquest. What happened after a city fell reveals an even more calculated system of control and terror. When Bukhara fell in 1220, The Mongols separated the population with industrial efficiency. Men on one side, women and children on another. The division wasn't random. It was categorized. Giovanni recorded how Mongol officers walked through the crowds of captured women, evaluating them like livestock. Beauty, youth, and social class determined fate. Noble women were set aside for generals or for Genghis Khan himself. Women of lower status were distributed among soldiers as rewards, part of the spoils system that kept the massive Mongol army motivated across years of campaigning. But the selection process reveals something darker than simple brutality. The Mongols weaponized humiliation. When they conquered a city, they deliberately targeted the wives and daughters of defeated nobles, forcing them into concubinage or marriage. This wasn't about desire, it was about erasure. To possess the women of a vanquished enemy was to eliminate his legacy, to ensure that even his bloodline would now serve Mongol purposes. Chinese, Persian, and Russian sources all corroborate the same pattern. Women were paraded, ranked, and distributed. Some were absorbed into Mongol households, losing their names and identities. Others were sold into slavery networks that stretched from the steppes to the UN court in China. The scale was staggering. After major conquests, thousands of women simply disappeared into the empire's vast interior, their lives completely rewritten by violence. One chronicle describes how mothers were separated from children during these selections, the sounds of their screaming echoing through the camps. The Mongols showed no sentimentality. Children above a certain height, measured against the axle of a cart, were often killed. Those below it might be spared, absorbed into Mongol society, raised to forget their origins. The women had no choice but to witness this and survive it. This wasn't chaos, it was policy, and it served a dual purpose, rewarding soldiers and destroying the cultural continuity of conquered peoples. A society whose women have been taken, whose children have been killed or assimilated, cannot easily rebuild its identity. The Mongols understood this instinctively, but perhaps no tactic reveals the Mongol approach to warfare more clearly than their use of human shields, a practice so coldly calculated it still shocks modern sensibilities. During the siege of Gurganj in 1221, one of the bloodiest confrontations of the Khwarezmian campaign, the Mongols faced unexpectedly fierce resistance. The city's defenders fought street by street, refusing to yield. Genghis Khan's response was characteristically ruthless. He ordered prisoners from previously conquered towns, men, women, elderly, children, to be driven forward ahead of his troops. These civilians were not combatants. They were tools. Their bodies absorbed the first volleys of arrows. Their presence forced defenders to choose between killing their own countrymen or holding their fire. The psychological torment was as effective as the tactical advantage. Giovanni wrote that the Mongols used the people of one city to batter down the next, a statement that captures the mechanized horror of this approach. Some prisoners were tied together to prevent escape. Others were forced to fill moats with earth while under fire, their bodies collapsing into the mud they carried. Still others were positioned in front of siege engines, human barriers between the weapons and the walls. If they survived the assault, they were often killed afterward, their usefulness exhausted. This tactic served multiple functions. It conserved Mongol lives. It exhausted enemy ammunition. It sowed confusion among defenders who hesitated to shoot at their own people. And, most importantly, it transmitted terror. Cities that heard what happened at Gurganj understood. Resistance wouldn't just cost your life in battle. It would cost the lives of your neighbors, your family, everyone you failed to protect. The guilt alone was a weapon. The Mongols didn't invent cruelty, but they perfected its application at scale. Every horror had a reason, every atrocity a function, and nowhere was this more evident than in their approach to punishment, particularly for those who betrayed them. After the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the Mongol generals Subutai and Jebi faced a problem. They had crushed a coalition of Russian princes and Kipchak allies, But they needed to send a message that would echo across the Russian principalities. Simply executing the captured nobles wouldn't suffice. The Mongols wanted something that combined humiliation, suffering, and symbolism. According to both Russian chronicles and Persian accounts, the captured princes, including Mstislav of Kiev, were laid face down on the ground. Then, Mongol soldiers constructed a large wooden platform directly on top of their living bodies. And on this platform, the Mongol commanders held a feast. The detail that makes this execution particularly horrifying is its duration. Death by suffocation under such weight wasn't instantaneous. As the feast continued, drinking, eating, celebrating, the princes beneath slowly suffocated under the combined weight of wood and men. Historical sources suggest the banquet lasted hours. By the time the Mongols finished, the nobles were dead, their bodies crushed, their lungs collapsed. But why this method? Why not a swift beheading? The answer lies in Mongol legal tradition and psychological warfare. In Mongol culture, spilling the blood of nobility was sometimes considered taboo, a strange scruple in an otherwise brutal society. So they devised a method that was technically bloodless yet utterly agonizing. The princes died without a blade touching them, satisfying both cultural prohibition and the need for exemplary punishment. More importantly, this execution was theater. The Mongols transformed death into spectacle, demonstrating their absolute dominance not just through victory, but through the very manner of killing. The message was clear. We can take your lives while we celebrate, treating your deaths as literally beneath us. The psychological impact on other Russian principalities was profound. For decades afterward, Russian princes hesitated to resist Mongol demands, remembering what happened at the Kalka River. For those who betrayed the Mongols directly, defectors, spies, governors who surrendered then rebelled, a different punishment awaited: being tied to horses and dragged until death. This wasn't a common battlefield execution. It was reserved specifically for traitors, those who violated the Mongol concept of loyalty that underpinned their entire imperial system. Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, emphasized absolute allegiance to the Khan and the state. Betrayal wasn't just a crime, it was an existential threat to the order that held the vast empire together. The execution was brutally simple. The condemned person's hands were bound, sometimes with their arms deliberately dislocated to prevent resistance. Ropes fastened them to a mounted horse. At the officer's command, the animal was spurred forward. The victim was dragged across whatever terrain lay ahead: rocks, dirt, thorns. Death could come from head trauma, from suffocation as they were dragged face down, from the sheer physical trauma of being pulled at speed across uneven ground. Historical accounts from Central Asia and the Middle East document this punishment being carried out against governors of conquered cities who later conspired with rival powers. The bodies were often dragged through the streets of the very cities they had betrayed, left displayed at the gates as a warning. The message was consistent. Betrayal of the Mongol order results not just in death, but in public degradation and suffering. What's striking about this punishment is its efficiency. Unlike elaborate executions that required preparation and audience, this could be carried out immediately, anywhere, with nothing more than a horse and rope. It was portable terror, ready to be deployed whenever loyalty was questioned. Yet, beneath all these tactics, the starvation, the human shields, the crushing platforms, the dragging deaths, lay a coherent philosophy that historians still debate. Were the Mongols simply sadistic? Or were they practicing a form of warfare so advanced in its psychological dimensions that we're only now beginning to understand it? The archive evidence suggests something unsettling. Genghis Khan and his generals understood that conquest isn't ultimately about battles. It's about will. A city with strong walls can resist for months, but a city that has watched its neighbors starve, seen its women enslaved, witnessed its leaders crushed beneath feasting soldiers, that city surrenders without a fight. The Mongols discovered that true military efficiency lies not in killing everyone, but in killing the right people in the right ways to make everyone else submit. Persian chronicler Juvaini, despite witnessing and documenting these horrors, occasionally recorded a strange observation. Cities that surrendered immediately to the Mongols were often treated relatively well. Their populations were spared, their infrastructure preserved. They were absorbed into the empire and left largely intact. It was only resistance that triggered the full machinery of Mongol terror. This reveals the calculated nature of their brutality. The Mongols weren't interested in violence for its own sake. They were interested in obedience. The extreme methods, the starvation sieges, the human shields, the humiliating executions, were advertisements of what resistance would cost. Once that message was understood, once cities began surrendering at the mere sight of Mongol scouts on the horizon, the actual violence could decrease. In a horrifying way, the Mongol approach was efficient. Fewer soldiers died, fewer resources were expended on prolonged sieges. The empire expanded with stunning speed across Asia and into Europe, not primarily through superior military technology, but through superior psychological warfare. They had learned to weaponize fear itself. But there's a detail that haunts the historical record, something that reveals perhaps the deepest horror of the Mongol conquests. In city after city, from Nishapur to Kiev, scribes and chroniclers kept writing. Even as their worlds collapsed, even as starvation gripped their streets and their leaders were crushed beneath feasting armies, someone kept documenting what was happening. Persian historians recorded the selections of women. Russian monks described the suffocating of princes. Chinese officials chronicled the distribution of captives. They wrote because they understood something essential. This needed to be remembered. Not celebrated, not justified, but remembered. The Mongols could conquer territory, could obliterate armies, could transform entire populations into displaced peoples. But they couldn't erase the written record. And in that record, preserved across 8 centuries, we glimpse not just what humans can do to each other, but what happens to those forced to witness it, to survive it, to carry its memory forward. The Mongol Empire eventually fragmented, as all empires do. Genghis Khan's descendants fought among themselves, the vast territories divided and subdivided. The tactics that built the empire, the starvation, the human shields, the calculated terror, faded from military practice, remembered primarily as historical horrors rather than strategic innovations. But the memory remained. In Russian folk songs, in Persian poetry, in Chinese historical texts. The peoples who survived the Mongol conquests carried forward stories that parents told children in whispered voices, warnings about what happened when the horsemen came from the east. These weren't legends or myths. They were documented history, verified by multiple independent sources, impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. And perhaps that's the final, most unsettling aspect of this story. We want to believe that such systematic brutality belongs to a primitive past, that modern warfare is somehow more humane, more civilized. But the Mongols weren't primitive. They were sophisticated, organized, and terrifyingly effective. They understood psychology, logistics, and the mechanisms of social control. They applied these understandings with ruthless clarity to achieve their goals. 800 years later, we're still trying to comprehend how an empire could function this way, how such calculated horror could be so successful, how the same society that produced remarkable administrative systems and facilitated trade along the Silk Road could also perfect the art of weaponized suffering. There's no neat moral to extract from this history, no comforting lesson about progress or human nature, just the weight of what happened, recorded in sources that cannot be ignored, witnessed by scribes who made sure we would know. They remembered. They recorded. They could not look away. Neither can we.